Welcome everyone to the October 8th City Council work session. Welcome everyone here and at home. We have 3 items on our agenda today. The first one is one that I asked to put on the agenda because I just thought since at League of Oregon Cities and everywhere else in the state they're talking about this issue, that we should have a chance to discuss what, if you have anything that you want to do in this regard. It's an ordinance concerning the establishment of a tax on marijuana. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just turn over to Glenn.
Thank you. What we're hoping you'll discuss today is whether you actually want to have this conversation. There is a tentative public hearing scheduled for your October 20th meeting. There is a draft ordinance that I prepared based on Medford's ordinance that is set up for that public hearing. If you decide today to confirm the public hearing, then there would just be the public hearing on that proposed ordinance with a work session that we hope you'll have immediately afterwards. There's nothing else on the agenda at 7:30 on your October 20th meeting, so you could hold a public hearing, then you could have the work session to give us direction as to what you would really like the final ordinance to look like. The ordinance that I used is the model, the Medford ordinance. I used that primarily because it was the broadest ordinance that's out there. And as you'll recall from some conversations we've had over the past couple months, there are times when if you decided to broaden something after the public hearing, I would tell you you needed an additional public hearing. So I wanted to use the broadest public hearing so that you could scale it back. That would not require another public hearing. So some of the issues that, should you decide to have this conversation, that you would need to decide, don't have to do it today, you can do it after the public hearing. Should the ordinance cover both recreational use and medical marijuana use? Should the ordinance tax just the retailers who are selling to the consumers, or should it also tax wholesalers, processors, and producers? And the Medford ordinance taxes, or the draft, it's only a draft ordinance at this point, it included tax for all of those. And so the one that I prepared as draft for your October 20th hearing, if you decide to have it, includes all that. If you have the public hearing, after that you could then give direction as to how you would want it to really be scaled back, and then we could do that with a proposed action date for October 27th. The reason why cities and counties are trying to move quickly with this is because of the theory that if something's adopted prior to the election, it has a greater chance of being grandfathered in than if it's adopted after the election. So by acting on October 27th, which is your last Monday night meeting before the election, you would have taken action prior to the November election. That's where we are, and so there is a prepared motion for you that would just confirm the October 20th public hearing if you decide that's where you want to go.
Yeah, the way I think maybe I want to proceed is to first ask if anybody has any questions of Glenn about what he just said, any clarifications, and then we'll just ask everybody what they want to do if anything, about this. Does anybody have any questions of Glenn? Seeing none. Yes, Mike, you have questions?
Thank you. My understanding of Measure 91 has this taxed at the state. Is it done similarly, retail, manufacturing, wholesale as well?
I believe the state, I haven't read through the entire measure. I know they tax on the retailers. I'm not sure if they have independent tax on wholesalers, processors, and producers. So I could find that out for you.
And the county?
The county has proposed what they talked about yesterday. They proposed 2 different ordinances. I'm not sure which ones the county board said to move forward. One of the ordinances just covers recreational use. One of them covers both recreational and medical marijuana use. And I believe that ordinance just imposes the tax on the entity selling to the consumer.
I'll have comments when we get to the right time.
So Counselor Betty, did you want to ask a question?
No, I wanted to be in the queue.
Okay, so I've got two more questions.
Before Mike.
Oh, you want to be in the queue?
Yes, ma'am.
You have a question?
I have a question. A lot of the actions being taken at the counties and metropolitan levels are assuming the ability to grandfather in, should it pass. Is that what you're saying?
There are two theories. One theory is the measure isn't as clear as it could have been in preempting cities and counties from actually imposing it. There are state statutes that are clear, and so some attorneys think they can argue successfully that even if the measure passes and the legislature does nothing, an ordinance still would be valid. The way I read the ordinance, I don't think that's the case. I think the court would actually say it's preempted. The other theory is that if enough cities and counties adopt something, then maybe the legislature will tweak the measure and say, okay, any city or county that has adopted an ordinance prior to the election date is grandfathered in. So if you adopt something before, you may get grandfathered in by the legislature.
And that's really the crux of my question is, I interpret grandfathering as be something you do when you've got a few outliers and you need to just accommodate them. My impression of grandfathering is not something you do to accommodate a large number of something. In other words, if you have 100 people and 50 of them do this and you create a law that's supposed to cover 100, but you grandfather 50 of them in, it seems that wouldn't seem to make sense. So the question I'm asking, in your opinion, since so many cities and counties are considering passing legislation, would that be a true incentive for the legislature to grandfather, or would it have the opposite effect of encouraging the legislature to say, we can't grandfather all these people in, forget the grandfathering piece? In your opinion, which way do you think the legislature might go?
That sounds
And I won't hold you to it.
That sounds like a question that would be better directed to all of you who deal with legislators more than I do.
Fair enough.
A former one sitting next to you.
But it would have to be a consideration. You're going to spend a lot of time on something that you know is not going to pass an argument and is likely to not be grandfathered in, then you have to take that into consideration.
True. And I don't actually know how many cities or counties actually are going to pass these. I mean, what I have learned from some of my colleagues in other city attorney offices is that they are considering them, but for most of the attorneys I've talked to, the councils haven't yet decided, haven't yet acted. I don't know if it's going to be 50. It may turn out to be 10 or 20 that actually adopt them. We just don't know. And as to what the legislature would do, there's, 36 counties, I think, and 240 cities, so you have 300 local governments. If 50 adopt them, you decide what that ratio.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to make you get too big of a crystal ball, but I want to get your professional sense of what you think these kinds of cases typically do.
As a legal issue, it doesn't matter whether it's 10, 20, or 50. The court isn't going to say, yes, it works under the legislation as passed by the voters, or it doesn't. From the legislature's perspective, in 20-plus years, I've seen the legislature come up, or at least consider grandfather clauses that run the gamut from, well, there are only 2 cities that have done it.
Right.
Let's grandfather them in. To, well, only 2 cities have done it. Apparently, it's not that important to cities, so we don't need to grandfather them in. It's a political issue that the legislature can deal with any way it wants.
Okay. Thank you.
I did have a question on, I don't know if you have Measure 91 in front of you.
I don't.
So do you know the set-asides they already have for distributing money for law enforcement costs in that measure?
I know that there are percentages in there. Is that your question?
Yeah, because what I really want is for the public and for us to know that that measure, should it pass, it does have some funds that are to be distributed for law enforcement purposes and other things already built into it.
True, and my recollection is that of the money that the state receives, or at least the money that it's going to distribute, that 10% would come to cities for primarily law enforcement purposes, although I don't know that. It says it has to be used for law enforcement as opposed to issues related to medical or to marijuana use. And I believe 10% is going to counties.
I have that right here. You want me to read it, Mayor? It's 40% to Common School Fund, 20% to State Medical Health, Alcoholism, and Drug Services, 15% to State Police, 10% to cities to assist in local enforcement, law enforcement, 10% to counties in the same to be administered in the same manner as the cities, and 5% to OHA, Oregon Health Agency, for alcohol and drug abuse prevention. So that should add up to 100.
Okay, thank you for that. George Brown, did you have a question you wanted to?
No, I was just going to present that same information.
Oh, okay. All right, I just want to be sure that people were aware that there was within that measure, there was some distribution already considered. I've got Councilor Taylor, Poling, and Clark, and now we'll be getting comments, questions, or over comments. Councilor Taylor.
Thank you. I'm glad it was pointed out that a lot of this, the state tax, will go for education, and that's very important to all communities. I don't think that we should tax it so much that that we won't stop the illegal market. That's what I'm concerned about. And I think one of the big reasons for passing this measure is to cut down on the crime related to drugs, street drugs. And if we price it so it's priced too high, if we tax it so much that it's still cheaper to buy from somebody on the street, it will not be good for law enforcement or for health or for the city. And I think we should not discuss it. I think we shouldn't waste time with a public hearing on it.
Councilor Poling.
Thank you. And I have not read Medford, so I don't know what all is in it, but I think any discussion in reference to possible new revenues for the city is worth having. So I'm in favor of moving forward with the public hearing. In a perfect world, I think what would have been a better approach is all the cities get together with Lane County and kind of do an umbrella county-wide tax, similar to what the state tax is doing, only divvying up the money amongst the county and in the different cities. But because it is such a time crunch involved, it leaves everybody scrambling on their own. So, I personally don't think that we should be having the discussion about taxing the medical marijuana, but it's worth having a discussion for the rest of it. So I would be in favor of the public hearing.
Councilor Surratt. Councilor Clark, sorry.
Thank you, Mayor.
Get them confused.
I know, sorry.
A city tax on marijuana is a terrible idea. Once we stack together the state tax, the county tax, the city tax, and everybody else who wants to get in on the action, we will have created a price for this thing that will defeat the purpose of Measure 91 in the first place. I don't know how I'll vote on the measure itself, but I think our contemplation of piling on and adding even more tax to this just helps the black market continue on, and it's a very bad idea.
So I've got Councilor Brown, Councilor DeLinka, Councilor Surratt. Councilor Brown?
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I think this is a real bad idea. Especially even thinking about taxing the medical marijuana. The city does not tax any pharmaceutical product now. We don't tax aspirin, we don't tax penicillin, we don't tax any of these things. We should not even be dreaming of taxing medical marijuana. We don't tax alcohol, we don't tax tobacco. That's not our job. The state does that and the feds do that. Through the form of excise taxes, and then those things trickle down to the counties and the municipalities from the state. The county should not be in the business of trying to tax this, and none of the municipalities should either. I think what Councilor Clark just said about making the retail price, the more taxes that are taxed on is the incentive to buy from legal distributors, legal stores, goes down. There's some evidence that that's already happened in Colorado. The revenues are about they're good. The revenues are good, but they're about half what they thought they would be. And the retail prices are higher than the black market prices, and so they're still pretty, I gather from researching it, that there's still pretty active black market pricing in Colorado. So, you know, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission is the one that regulates the sale and distribution, the taxing of alcohol. And they would be, under Measure 91, they would be the ones responsible for regulating marijuana sales. They already know how to do this. They already have the whole infrastructure in place. There's no reason. Now, the city would have to create their own infrastructure. The county would have to create an infrastructure for for collecting from all the retailers and wholesalers. So it's just a bad idea all the way around. And I don't think we should pursue it with the public hearing. I think we should just drop it. I don't think we have any business getting in the tax collection business from marijuana. Sure, the city could use more revenue, but this isn't the way to get it. It's going to cause all kinds of other problems.
Councilor Zelenka?
So the Legislative Revenue Office, according to the materials, said about $940,000 to counties and another $940,000 to cities in the whole state would come out of the measure based on their estimate. And so ours would be a little chunk of that. So it's not going to be a whole lot of money. I'm not in favor of taxing medical marijuana. I am in favor of Measure 91. I think it's likely to pass. I am concerned about jacking up the retail price so much so that it pushes people into the black market and defeats the purpose of Measure 91. I think that would be a bad outcome. And if everybody keeps piling on, like Mike was saying, I think that's a bad outcome. I'm also concerned about the precedents about taxing a product. We don't do that. This would be the first time we ventured into that, I believe. I can't think of anything that we taxes. Kind of a slippery slope. So I'm not sure how I'd vote on the whole thing, but I think it would be an interesting public hearing, entertaining at least. So I think it's worth having a discussion, hear what people have to say. I don't think it can hurt, but that would also help inform me about what people are thinking, and we'd also get our traditional emails and letters and phone calls that would inform us about this issue as well.
Councilor Surratt?
Thank you. So I appreciate the comments of my colleagues. I agree with a lot of them. I'm ambivalent about the idea of the city imposing its own tax on this product. I absolutely agree medical marijuana should not be taxed. It's a medicine. And I agree with a number of the arguments against the idea of a local tax. But I do see some value in holding a public hearing and hearing from the public. The mayor brought this to us out of a sense of due diligence that there might be an opportunity to raise revenue for the city. We've struggled with different ways of doing that. I don't necessarily think jumping on to the new tidbit is the way to go, but I do think there's some value in hearing from the public if they agree with what seems to be some coalescing majority on the council, or if they have a different perspective on how we should look at this potential new source of revenue. So I would support a public hearing. I don't know if I would support ultimately the city imposing a tax at the local level.
Okay, Councilor Pryor?
Yeah, this has been helpful. What I didn't want to do was feel like I was going to be wasting time. And so what I'm hearing is if we go forward with a public hearing, it would probably not be an enormous amount of additional time beyond having the public hearing to hear what the public has to say. That doesn't mean I would be supportive of the revenue option, because I agree with the notion this is something that should be handled at the state level. And it is a slippery slope to start getting into what should local jurisdictions be dictating. We've had that conversation before just not too long ago. And I would like to see many of these things happen at the state level, and if 91 passes, a lot of it would happen at the state level, and we can't guess what would happen with regard to grandfathering. It sounds like we couldn't make the argument. We would only have to consider perhaps a grandfathering option, so that is something I have to take into mind. So I am willing to go ahead and vote in favor of having a public hearing, but that in no way, shape, or form, just from hearing my colleagues, is any indication that we would ever actually vote to have an actual tax. I've always been in favor of more information. I think that's all this does for us. So I'm willing to go ahead and support having a public hearing, but that is not in any way, shape, or form to be interpreted as us moving toward an actual tax on marijuana.
Councilor Brown?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, what I'm hearing around the table is there doesn't seem to be enthusiastic support for imposing a tax on marijuana, recreational or medical. My question is, why bother with the public hearing? Because, I mean, if you're not really supporting something, I don't think that, you know, a high possibility of voting against it. I think it is kind of a waste of time to have a public hearing. And, you know, it's just like, where's it going to end? So we start with recreational marijuana. Let's say we leave medical out. Well, all right, well, why not? Hey, you know, we could raise some money by taxing, like, wine consumption in Eugene. We could have a city tax on cigarettes. We could have a city tax on beer. Pretty soon we've got a sales tax. Well, guess what? Oregon doesn't have a sales tax. So we're, you know, it's like, where's this going to lead? I just think we ought to drop the whole thing right now. Thank you.
Councilor Clark?
Thank you, Mayor. What's that phrase? Politics creates odd bedfellows. I find myself in agreement with my colleagues next to me entirely in some of the other things that were said. I think Alan was right there, too, that with a couple of the things that he mentioned, this is the first time we're discussing a specific tax on a specific product. I'm not sure that's a road we want to go down. I think it is an admirable thing to do, and I agree with the mayor, you know, bringing it up for our discussion today. That's a good thing for us to do. That's a responsible thing. It's also a very good thing, especially in Oregon, to let the public be heard. There's always a need for that, and that's always wise for our deliberations. But those who would want to be heard in the affirmative on this particular subject, I have a difficult time imagining outrage that we wouldn't impose a new tax in Eugene. I have a difficult time imagining there would be outrage at the lack of an opportunity for the public to discuss it. I think it would do our community and frankly ourselves a great deal better for us to just say clearly, no thank you.
Councilor Evans?
You know, we discuss a whole lot of things at this table, and we discuss a whole lot of things in public hearings. And given the time crunch that we're under, and I think that it is incumbent upon us to get feedback from the public. There's no harm, no foul in that, and I don't see any reasonable argument why we shouldn't have a public hearing and hear from the public on the subject. Whatever way that we fall along the spectrum around this table, it could help inform us in terms of what the public is thinking on this subject and maybe give us a different perspective as to how we approach this. Because clearly I know I don't have all of the answers around this, and I don't know what the compression issues would be with, you know, state tax, county tax, local tax, whether that would be, you know, an encouragement for the black market to continue to thrive and grow. But, you know, I know that legalization is a whole nother issue, and it is an issue that I think that we need to, you know, hear from our constituents on. So I'm going to vote in favor of having a public hearing.
I'm going to ask the Council President to put the motion on the table.
I move to confirm that the City Council will hold a public hearing on October 20th on an ordinance to adopt a tax on the sale of marijuana.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In opposition, 1, 2, 3. It passes. Thank you. All right, next item up is City Hall.
Thank you, Mayor. And what we're going to do is pass out the questions that you were working through last time, and then if you'd just like to, we suggest you just pick it up from there. And
Glad you brought him.
Make sure we get to this with the notes.
So just to clarify, City Manager, did we not do number 4?
You did not do number 4. You did 4 questions, but it's because we added what is labeled here as 3A. And you
Okay.
didn't get question 4.
All right, I think, I guess I thought 3 covered that, but I guess it doesn't. We said it's only on one half, but we didn't say the 25,000 square feet, right? So the question is, should the new city hall be constructed in phases, with phase 1 consisting of approximately 25,000 square feet, occupied primarily by mayor and council, council chambers, and city manager's office? And city manager, in our current configuration, we have legal staff with us here. Would they be in, are you envisioning that?
Yes,
That's
and
right.
also to include, we have some city manager office functions that are currently at the atrium that we would be planning on bringing over as well.
And could you tell us what those are?
Neighborhood Services and the Human Rights Commission, community engagement.
And part of the city manager's office are the people who make all of this work.
The recorder's office, there's the sustainability office is a part of that. Of course, there's administrative support. There's support directly to the public affairs office, city attorney's office, and all of those things.
And communications, right?
Communications, yes.
Yep. All right. All right. Discussion. I'll just go around the table.
I support number 4 on the list.
Okay.
I don't need to discuss it any
Yes, so do I. Even in the early process here a few years back, the discussion overwhelmingly addressed this issue that it should be done in a phased approach, and I agree with that 100%.
I agree with this statement as well, although I don't presume phase 2 anytime soon, nor am I going to hold my breath for phase 2. So this doesn't imply a phase 2, but it sort of does by saying there's a phase 1, but it doesn't say anything about phase 2. So with that caveat, I'll support it, because I don't believe we're going to get to phase 2, and I don't think that's a discussion that we really need to have at this point anyway. I think that's something that we can have down the road, maybe years from now, in fact.
I think we discussed taking up that discussion, or deciding to take up that discussion, as soon as we get through what we're doing currently. Councilor Clark.
I disagree, but it's really pointless at this point, because there aren't really any other options. We've already begun. There isn't any other choice. We don't have a plan, so this is by default what we're doing. I don't think it's wise. I disagree with my friend. I do think that both we should have a phase 2, and that the public rather expects that we'll have a phase 2. I think that if the majority of the public were aware that it may be, I'm not saying that it is our intention, but if it were our intention not to build a phase 2, I think if the public were aware of that, they would be much less supportive of phase 1. And I think they assume we are going to build phase 2. I think it's only responsible of us to have a better plan than we have so far. So I would like to see us having a workshop, or a work session rather, as soon as possible, to identify that publicly as phase 1 is being done, because I think it's the responsible thing to do.
Is that a yes or no?
On which question? On number 4 is specific. Should the new city hall be constructed in phases? No, I think we should stop and have a better plan for phase 2 before.
Councilor Brown.
Well, yeah, before I make my comments, there's a bit of old business that I'd like to get the answer to. I asked our last work session in City Hall, I asked who prepared the remodel estimates and who prepared the refutation of Turner Construction's estimates. I wanted to know the company's name and the person's name who gave us those dollar amounts for criticizing Turner's estimates. Do we, may I know who that person is and that company
Engineer
is?
firm, and what I responded is, of course, that Rob Brokaw is responsible for those.
Rob Brokaw, yeah, they're design, I mean, like architects, they're not engineers. I'm assuming they hired an engineer, and I'd just like to know the person's name who put those figures
Who's the
together.
engineer?
We know who did the Turner estimates. We know.
Architectural cost consultants.
Yes, and what was that person's name?
Firm. Company's name.
That's the name of the company.
But so we don't get to know the name of the actual person who walked
It's a
the
team
site.
of people that do the work.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. All right, that's kind of a non-answer, but I guess that's all we get. Yeah, I kind of agree. I find myself agreeing with Councilor Clark again, and back to the question of should it be constructed in phases. I mean, I don't even know if this question should be on the list. It's like we really haven't had any kind of an in-depth discussion of how this whole thing's going to be planned out, and certainly nothing really meaningful about phase 2. And yet, question number 2, should future City Hall be new construction or should it be renovated? The clear consensus was new. So to me, that says, well, you're going to go ahead and build new construction. So therefore, I'm not even sure that this question seems kind of redundant. We don't have enough money to build the whole thing. Therefore, it would have to be done in phases. But there's no, since we haven't had a discussion of phase 2, it's hard for me to say yes on this question, so I think I'll just say no. I've got a question, though, that's related to this. Has the environmental remediation been put out for bids yet? The asbestos and lead and so on?
be put out tomorrow.
The RFP for bids, okay. And generally, how long does that take to get the responses and evaluate and make the decision who you're going to pick?
3 to 4 weeks.
3 to 4 weeks, okay. All right, thank you.
Councilor Taylor?
Thank you. I agree with George that I don't know why we're even talking about this. It has been decided that unfortunately, that we're destroying the current City Hall, and that we obviously don't have any money for doing 2 phases. So, since I think repair, remodel, and repair is what we should be doing, and I will probably vote no on this because it's meaningless.
Councilor Evans?
I think we've already set out a path. I'm voting yes.
Councilor Pryor?
Ever since this became reality and not fantasy, it's always been talked about in phases. That's the only way we were able to go from fantasy to reality, was to talk about this in phases. Even Otto's very creative idea still was built in phases. You would build the first phase and then you would have the shell to build the second phase. We presumed phases was the only way to actually get this done. So that's always been an assumption on my part for years, that the only way we could make this happen was in phases. Whether or not there's a phase 2, I think, is a good question. What phase 2 might look like. I'm assuming there will be a phase 2, but I don't know exactly what phase 2 might look like. So I think that's a good conversation to have. But that doesn't prevent us from having a phase 1. We know we need to have a council chambers. We know we need to have an administrative center. So phase 1 is an important part, and phase 2 can then be added in. When the committee first met on this, Mike and Alan and myself, we talked about how the city government functions could be broken up into logical chunks. And if you can break them into logical chunks, you can build facilities to accommodate those logical chunks. And so that's why phasing to me seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So I will absolutely vote in favor of number 4. I think it is in keeping with what we've been saying for years we wanted to do.
So as I read this, it's 5 in favor of this particular answer, 5 yeses and 3 nos, and we will have to take note of those, right?
Mayor, my preference is that you just ask people to raise their hands.
Show of hands.
Okay, all those who, yes.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sure.
How do I want to phrase that? This is actually a split question, because the way Chris answered it, I would agree that, yeah, we've always discussed this in phases, but we've already come to that conclusion. My disagreement isn't with have we discussed this in phases and is that the logical way to proceed, because that seems, based on what we can afford, to be the logical way to proceed from where we are. However, my problem is in charging ahead with our fingers crossed without a good plan for phase 2, because I think that's how we ended up with a couple of holes in the ground in downtown. I think we should stop and have a decent plan for phase 2 prior to charging ahead. So would you define this question that my comments would be a no vote? I'm not entirely sure.
I think your comments would be a no vote.
All right.
Yeah.
So all those who are supportive of the new city hall being constructed in phases, with phase 1 consisting of approximately 25,000 square feet occupied primarily by mayor, council chambers, and city manager's office, please indicate.
Without a plan for phase 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In opposition, 3, it passes. Next question. Should the existing council chamber be relocated on a city hall block and mothballed, either for part of phase 2 or for some other purpose? Discussion. Want to go start this one?
I think if the cost is not prohibitive, and my sense is the cost is not prohibitive, it's reasonable to keep that particular place in reserve, and we can figure out a disposition for it later. So I'm happy to vote for it.
So I probably should have done this before you made your comment, Chris, but we probably should clarify the costs before we go any further in this discussion.
It's estimated to be $350,000 to $400,000, and what that would be is to move it from its current location continue onto that block under the appropriate place for the site. Mothballed, meaning that it wouldn't have access to it, so it would actually be there, and we wouldn't have heat into it and all those kinds of things. And then at some future date, if we chose to use it for either phase 2 or some other purpose, then it could be repurposed at that time. It won't be inexpensive to do that, but it would be then available to do something with that.
Councilor Evans.
I'm going to vote yes on this because I feel that, well, there's 2 parts to my response to this. One is, if this is the way that we're going to go on number 5, I would vote yes for it. I think as part of a commitment we have to the investment in our past, for our present, and for our future, that we retain some semblance of the iconic nature of City Hall. And having the council chambers jacked up, moved over onto the site, I would say is part not of phase 2, but of phase 1A. And I think that we need to look at this in the same context that we have looked at Civic Stadium. We didn't have a lot of traction in the community around how we would finance saving Civic Stadium, what that would look like, but we bought enough time so that we had private groups come forward, and now I think we're on the threshold of having a proposal that saves Civic Stadium without having a significant public exposure in terms of a financial investment to that. I think that we can do something similar to this with City Hall. There are grant funds available for historic preservation. There are private entities in the community that I have spoken with that have an interest in preservation of this particular facility. And I think that this is the perfect opportunity for a public-private partnership that can sustain our history well into the future for future generations to be able to engage and enjoy. We can use it for a meeting place. We can use it for a museum, which Eugene does not have a museum to honor its history. There are a number of different uses we can apply to this particular facility. So I would like to keep this alive and in the city portfolio as part of what I would consider phase 1A of the City Hall, new City Hall project.
Councilor Taylor.
I agree that we should save it, and what Greg said about grants is really important. I have asked about grants in the past and been told we had to have a plan first. We might have been able to get a grant to save the whole thing, but there are grants for historical properties. I don't know any reason why it couldn't still be used for meetings, and I don't know what's happened to it since we left it, but it might be used for council meetings still. A museum's a good idea, too, a museum to remember this is a part of our history we did not totally destroy. Thank you.
Councilor Brown?
Yeah, I'm real ambiguous about this one. When you demolish all the buildings around it and you've destroyed the interior garden, then you have this circular building with no context. I mean, it fit perfectly in the whole arrangement. That it was really actually a beautiful design. I really like that garden. But since you've destroyed all context, I just wonder if it's worth saving. I mean, I think maybe before we vote on this, it's going to be 3 weeks before, a firm will be chosen for environmental remediation. It'll be another probably a few weeks before someone's chosen for demolition. I don't know that we have to decide this right today. We might want to wait a little while on this one and have, look at possible designs. I mean, it's probably going to have to be moved. I don't know if it could stay where it was, but it's going to change, what happens with underground parking. I see one of the other questions coming up is, should the design team continue to develop options for underground parking? Maybe this could be tied in with that question. I think they should. I think number 7, I think they should continue to develop options for underground parking, and it seems like number 5 and number 7 are kind of related, because either the building stays where it is and gets shored up seismically, or, if the majority decides that we should save it, or it's going to have to be moved. And that's going to impact question number 7 and possibly question number 8. So I'm not real sure. I don't especially even really want to vote on it right now, but I'd like to see this delayed till we get a little bit more information from the design team.
Councilor Clark?
Thank you, Mayor. There's no way we should make this decision today. We don't have the appropriate information to make it. What we have from the design team, our architects, and the development team that are put together on this made a very clear presentation that the council chambers were horribly energy inefficient, that they were constructed in a fashion that no longer meets anything close to code, that, and not to mention that the manager just told us of a fairly large size expense just for holding on to it, while we still don't have a plan for phase 2, so we don't have any idea how we'd use it. So we're going to spend near $500,000 again and cross our fingers. I think it's a bad idea. It's not to say that I don't recognize the value of trying to preserve some of our history, but I don't know how it is we're going to use it yet, and if it's a good value for the taxpayer and a smart idea to do it. So I think those questions can be answered more appropriately with time, and we should answer them only when we have the best information to do it. So I hope we will postpone this particular decision.
Councilor Zelenka?
Yeah, I like the idea of preservation of the past, but not at any cost. And $400,000 seems like a lot of money to me without a plan. I need a few answers to several questions before I can say yes to this, and I would need a plan, and we don't have one. So, for instance, where does the $400,000 come from? I don't want it to come from the $15 million, so that's a big question. Do we have an answer to that?
I don't, but I would. What we would anticipate doing is having an additional revenue source rather than the $15 million for this project.
So we'd have to identify that. and then we don't have a plan of what we would use it for, and what it would cost to inhabit the structure, and what it would cost to maintain it once we inhabited it, and if it would change so much that what we were saving wasn't what we thought we were saving. Structurally, it doesn't meet code, and it has single pane glass. It's aluminum structure. I think it would change. It potentially could change so much that we wouldn't be preserving what we thought we were preserving in order to inhabit it. You can't just pick that building up and plunk it down and then say, okay, go in and use it. You'd have to bring it all up to code, and I think that would be extremely expensive, but we really don't know because we don't know what we would want to. And inhabitation is you either are or not. If it's just going to be a museum, we can leave it there and you can look at it from the outside and look in and say, oh, that's where they used to meet. But if we're going to use it, then we have to spend a lot of money. It could be, several $1 million, could be $2 million. I think we have other needs and more pressing needs than that.
Councilor Foley.
Thank you. If I remember the presentation correctly, kind of the nutshell discussion about the council chambers is if it were to be moved and brought up to current code, it wouldn't be recognizable as it is today. So, I kind of agree with Alan. Without a plan and without the money, I can't see the point of trying to pick it up and move it and save it if it's not going to look like what it looks like now, and that's what people are concerned about, is we want to maintain that facility. So I'm not in favor of trying to pick it up and move it at a $250,000 to $400,000.
So I'm pretty skeptical of this idea, but not opposed to continuing the discussion and getting additional information, which I think would help inform this more. I do tend to agree with what my last two colleagues said about the retrofit creating a situation where it's not the same building. And part of me almost feels like maybe the plan should be to let us tear that down and someone can go build a replica of it somewhere else with modern materials. It's concrete and glass. It's not the historic timbers of Civic Stadium. I don't actually accept that comparison. I think part of the other challenge is Civic Stadium wasn't in a situation where it was keeping progress from happening on other projects. So it could sit there while we took time to figure out if there was a way to preserve it. I would not be in favor of trying to preserve the council chamber at the expense of moving forward with the construction of our new city hall. So I have questions. I'm not hugely inclined to support this, but I would be willing to get more information and have a more thorough conversation. So I know this isn't necessarily formal motions, but perhaps the suggestion should be to table this particular question for another session.
So I just want to put a couple more things into thinking, and then if someone wants to move to table, that's fine. But I just want you to think about, if you move something, then it is not there. I mean, it's not embedded into the foundation. It's set somewhere else, so it's not usable when you move it. And secondly, as you said, the retrofitting would have to take place before it could be used. And the demolition schedule, should this be demolished, according to what Mike Penwell told me, I think was December, right, Mike? So you have some time to think about whether you want to mothball or demolish until December. And one of the things you could think about is whether you want to think about this sort of in a civic context of, okay, so from now until December, if someone wants to show up with money and a really good idea for what to do with it, you have that opportunity. Once that door closes, then we move forward with our plan. So that is something I've thought a lot about this. How can you create a window of opportunity if there's somebody out there that has the resources? Because actually I don't think we do. And so if somebody's out there that has the resources that can accomplish something that they want, that retains this building, then we would have an opportunity for someone to step forward to do something of that of that nature. And if it worked on-site or somewhere else, that would be up to the person who had that idea. So I just want to put that out there for you to think, because it just creates, it's not going to slow down anything as I understand it, and it does create a window of opportunity for something to happen if there is that desire and those resources in the community to do that. Councilor Evans?
I'm willing to make a motion to table this in lieu of a plan being brought forward from concerned community members and others who have expressed a deep interest in preservation of the city council chambers. I think that, we do have a small window of time, about, 6 or 7 weeks. But, things are doable within that time frame. And if we can have a reasonable, sensible plan that can come forward, a way to get to the other side of this, I think it's worth us having the time out and tabling number 5 until we can get there. We've done that with other things, and we've been able to have other people in the community come forward with some creative and, productive planning that will get us to the other side of some difficult issues. So I think we need to be flexible enough to tap on those resources that are out there and hope that that thinking will come up with something. And if it doesn't, I know how to go along with the situation depending on what happens.
I'll second with clarification.
So I'm
Point of order. Well, until when?
I haven't made any motion.
Oh, I thought you said.
Nothing to table.
I thought he moved
You said
to.
you moved to
I
table.
would move to table. I didn't
Yes,
move to
but
table.
we actually
I
don't
was
have a
making
motion.
a comment.
We don't.
There's nothing to table.
We
There's just,
actually don't have a motion on the table.
Just delay.
yeah, well, we just take number 5 off and delay.
City manager wants to say something first.
If you choose to do this, which would be fine, if you choose to, what we would need is, we would want to actually start the demolition as we're sort of moving into December, and so we would, if somebody were to come forward with dollars and the council would have to process that actually would have to occur before December 1st, for example, and so we would just want to help set the timeline for that if that's what you choose to do.
So is that our drop dead date, my birthday?
But
You said December 1st, so.
what I would suggest is if you do table this, what we would do is send out to you, here's a timeline that could kind of meet that date for the demolition as well.
So what I really want to understand is it appropriate to put a table motion out? Because the advantage of a
Just
table,
delay.
the advantage of a table motion is there's no discussion, and we say yes or no. If we can't do that because it's not appropriate, then as discussion continues, I reckon.
You are correct. There is nothing to table. My suggestion for a motion would be move to postpone a decision on this question until sometime in November, with the understanding that once the manager has sort of what timeline is really necessary to not delay the demolition, that he gets that information to you. But if you want to put a motion on to accomplish what you're talking about, my suggestion, it would be a motion to postpone until sometime in November, consideration of question 5.
Well, then I'll move what you just said.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Yes.
So realistically, what you're talking about is a plan. So you have to say, where would we put it? What would we do with it? What would it cost? How would it change? And scope all that out, and you have a couple of weeks. Is that really doable?
I think what would be really difficult in that is, so what do you reuse it as? And so I don't see that realistically in the next several weeks. The cost to move it and mothball it, we know that range. It's that, what did I say, 350 to 400,000. The cost to renovate it, we would have some sense of that because we took a look at that as part of renovating that as part of a reusable city council chamber. So we have some information around that, so we could provide that information to you. But the actual reuse, and then where it would sit on the site also would be a difficult question, because that gets into the whole site plan. And so where specifically on site, what the actual reuse for it, I don't think we'd be able to get back to you for a final answer on those.
Okay, I don't need to have a specific reuse. We can figure that out later, but it suffices to say that we would inhabit it. And in order to do that, you'd need to do all these things to it.
Right, it would have a cost associated with that, and we could get you a range of what that cost would be, I think.
Okay.
So the order that I'm trying to think of this in is, and Glenn, you help me to be sure I'm saying this right, is if you want to keep talking about this, then you might support the postponement. If you do not want to talk about this anymore, your mind is made up, and in some people's case that you don't want to have a further discussion about the chambers, saving the chambers, and you would vote no on this. All right. So this is a postponement. Yes, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll vote in favor of this, but there's a question that's not on this sheet that bears on what we're talking about. It's similar, and I don't know whether we should add it later or address it. I'm going to bring it up about other materials in the City Hall that ought to be saved or resold. For example, the shrubs, and I've had multiple constituents approaching me about how much money is being lost in people being told in the construction process they can take things that are still left in the building rather than sell them. If you look alone at the copper in the pipes and the wiring in that building, you're in the tens, if not close to hundreds of thousands of dollars of value. Are we doing everything necessary to salvage all other materials?
Mayor, Mike, that would
And I
be a
don't know whether
question
that's
to-
another topic for us to discuss or how I might get a better answer from staff on that.
That would be something to bring up when there is not a motion to postpone question number 5, because it's not directly germane to question number 5. So you should bring it up after the council decides what to do with this question of whether to postpone question 5.
Okay?
Councilor Evans.
I don't know if this would be appropriate or not, but could we have a mayor's or council's blue ribbon committee made up of staff and citizens to assist staff in kind of putting together a plan, a vision for this, and the time frame that we have to deal with it? I think that we have enough expertise in the community amongst professionals that would be more than willing to volunteer in assisting us to get to some reasonable conclusion around this.
I don't have a concern of various folks participating in the process. My concern is just the timeline to do all of that done and then actually have the council make a decision. If at the end of the day the council says, yes, we do want to do something with the council chambers into the future, and we don't know exactly what that is, then I think it would be, well, let's move it, mothball it, and then have the appropriate time to decide what that actually will be at that point. So I think it would be very difficult to come up within a few weeks a complete plan for that, but I have no concerns if others participate in that conversation.
Yeah.
The question for me is, should people want to continue this discussion? There's a difference between thinking that the city's going to take up all the cost or creating an opportunity for someone else to take up all the cost. I mean, that's a discussion we had around Civic. We can't do it ourselves, but if there's somebody else who wants to, we want to create an opportunity. That's another question, and I don't know how you think that should be sequenced.
It's
Because you're talking about a really short period of time here, but I don't want us to put the horse before the cart before we even have a chance to talk about that. That's comes after the postponement question, I guess. Anyway, think about it. All right.
And there could be an interim piece to that is a public-private partnership in some form or fashion.
So we're going to vote on the postponement now. All those in favor of the postponement, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in opposition. So we're going to postpone it till the first time we can bring it back up again, right? Is that the,
Yes, we will come back to you with more information and timeline for that.
and we have to wait all the way through till November? Is that the,
No, I don't think it said the date that we'd postpone it to, so we will what we'll do is send something out to the council that gives additional information around timing and some of this other information that we have, and then we'll figure out how we actually schedule it back in front of the full body.
and maybe what you guys could all be helpful with in this is there's probably a sequencing of questions that we need to get answered. There's information with it, so you don't want to be getting information for a direction nobody wants to go. So somehow we have to sequence this in a way where we ask the right questions to find out how much we need to know to get to our decision point, right? Okay, so do you want me to stop on this particular item and go to the quiet zoning?
Yeah, just two quick things. One is with Mike's earlier question around bushes and all, we'd be happy to send some information to the council on sort of all of that. So we'll just send out information on that, so it might be easier. The last several items, I feel like they're, I was going to say relatively easy, but perhaps not. And so if you could possibly get through them quickly, that would be great.
better.
If not, then when we should go on to the new
I
one.
just give people warning that we only got a half hour here, so probably won't get to the quiet zones if we could. We may, but probably not. Okay, we'll move on. Councilor Zelenka.
Relating to Mike's comment, when the mayor asked for questions, I submitted a question, didn't make it on the list, but I'll just read it because it's right on point here. Should we set a goal that we will reuse or recycle 90% of the existing building, including but not limited to the art, the cedar on the exterior of the building, the plants, the interior courtyard, paver blocks, concrete, metal, and art? So that was in keeping with what you were talking about.
So,
And also, I think that Master Gardeners actually came in a couple of weeks ago and did start to remove a lot of the plants that were.
So we'll provide that kind of information.
I think I just want to say, City Manager, I think it's important. I understand the memo, and you want to give accurate information, so you don't want to do it off the top of your head. But I think it's pretty important that, since this has been said at this table, the implication that it's being taken away or given away, or we're not handling it in a way that some people might think we should be handling it. I think we need to really have accurate information for the public as well as
And
us.
so we can put out the information, then we'd be happy at one of your regular meetings is just talk about it.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That helps with constituent questions.
So, number 6, should Phase 1 of a new city hall reflect Rural Rock House final conceptual design, including a plaza or public space along 8th Street, city council chambers, and improved accessibility? And I'll just go around and ask yes or no.
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah, well, it's hard to answer that because it says final conceptual design. Well, conceptual is something that's still up in the air. I'm willing to vote yes for this as long as there's still going to be opportunities for refinement along the way. I'm assuming refinement, so that's what makes this a hard question to answer.
We can take out the word final, I think, right?
Yeah, I think I'm supportive of continuing the Phase 1 discussion around the conceptual design we've been looking at. That's what I'm comfortable supporting.
How
Yeah,
about current conceptual?
yeah, the current.
Yeah, that's,
All right, so you're okay?
I'm okay.
Yes?
What's meant by accessibility?
Well, I think it's ADA, but I think it's more than that. I think it's accessible to the streets. We talk about sort of that access on the north and south access through the building, accessibility to others, a community that wants to use the space. So there's a variety of aspects to accessibility.
Accessible to floodwaters, too. So you're saying this will be more accessible than the current former,
Correct.
which was accessible from 4 directions. Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Brown?
Yes, no.
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
Oh, well, yes. I mean,
Okay.
Take a vote.
Clark?
Sure, yeah, why not?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're ready for a vote, and so all those who agree with this statement, show yes. 1, 2, 3,
I thought we
4,
just did all
5,
that.
6, 7 yes, and one and opposition 1. Okay, done with that one. I just want to make one more statement before we go on to the next piece. Is my understanding, and from some of the testimony we've had, is that some people with disabilities feel like our current city hall is not as accessible to them as they would like it to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's both how you get into it and out of it, but I also think it's the configuration of the workspaces are very hard for people to utilize who are have disabilities. So I think our goal is not just to be accessible in a broader sense, but to be very more usable for everybody, right? Okay. Should the design team continue to develop options for underground parking? Anybody need to talk about that one? Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
Councilor Zelenka.
So the current conceptual design is at grade building, so I'm wondering how this impacts the design, how that would occur if it were going to be underground. I suspect it would be under the new building. Could set up. You could excavate the rest of it, but I would suspect that would be filled in the interim. Do you have any idea of how much it would cost? Underground parking is really expensive. $35,000, $30,000 a slot. And where would that money come from? Would it come out of the $15 million, or are you looking to another potential pool of money?
Really, all this is saying is if you'd like us to continue with the options, we would be coming back to the council with any and all of those questions. It'll be the same with number 8. It's the same kind of a question.
Okay.
And I've got Councilor Pullen and Councilor Brown.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, we can go ahead and continue looking at it and bring back, possible costs and that type of stuff. If it doesn't pencil out, we can always use the excess land temporarily for surface parking. But yeah, let's at least take a look at it.
Be a park.
Councilor Brown?
Well, thank you, Mayor. Well, I wasn't aware that there were options for underground parking. All of the drawings I've seen show, everything gets knocked down and then the pit gets filled in, and the building is built on top of it, and a surface parking lot is built up on top. So it's news to me that there were even options for underground parking, and if that can be worked in, I think we should, because people are going to be driving for a long time, and it's just a fact that people, and they will for some years, in spite of public transportation improvements. So yeah, if they can incorporate underground parking, I'm all for that. I just didn't know it was an option, because every drawing I've seen, it never showed it.
Want to speak to that, City Manager?
You're correct. The drawings haven't shown it because up to this point, the conceptual design has not had the underground parking in it, and so that's what this question really is there are some options for that, and we just want to ensure that the council would like us to continue to pursue those and spend time on that and then bring those back to you.
Councilor Pryor?
Yeah, I would absolutely support continuing to look at possible options for both underground parking and a possible fourth floor. We're not committing, and I frankly think underground parking would be very desirable if it were cost effective and could be incorporated in. So I'm very interested in knowing what our options might be. We may turn out not doing them, but I certainly want to know what the options for both of those would be.
Councilor Evans?
Well, the last time I had a conversation about parking and developing new parking spaces, it was looking like $65,000 per space for commercial parking. So as much parking as we can retain underground, above ground, whatever we can do in terms of that, I think we need to explore all available opportunities with regard to that.
Okay, so all those who want to continue to develop options for underground parking, please indicate. 1, 2. It's everybody? All right. And now the same question, I'll ask if there's any questions about the question for number 8, explore, develop options for fourth floor. Any questions on that? Okay,
Just
yes.
one. As long as we're also looking at not only developing up, but also out, would there be some of that involved in this also, or is it just strictly adding a floor?
This is for the vertical piece, essentially the footprint is
Sure.
established.
Yep. Again, it's always worth a look.
Councilor Brown?
Well, this is kind of the same thing. I was never aware that there was a fourth floor presented in any of the options. I don't recall. But, yeah, I think we should pursue it, sure.
City Manager?
And you're correct, similar to underground parking, we haven't been showing fourth floors because it hasn't been a part of their final conceptual design. And so it is an option, a possibility, and so this would just be, again, expending some work to do that.
Okay, so all of those who think the design team should develop options for fourth floor indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In opposition, 1. It passes. Last up here is, should the design team continue to develop options for making the City Hall as energy efficient as practicable, gold LEED or equivalent, net zero energy, or net zero water ready? Discussion? Questions? All those who think that it should continue to develop those options, please indicate. 8. It passes. Got it done. All right.
Right now.
You want to begin anything on the next round?
You have a time to do a presentation, part of it? Why don't we just start,
Okay.
because there's some information that we can give out, and
We're
then we
going to
can
be
pick it up.
talking about railroad quiet zone.
Thanks, Tom. I'll just turn it over to Tom, and he can get us started. Tom and Robin.
Exactly.
Good afternoon.
You're obviously not getting emails and phone calls that I'm getting.
So by council request, we're back. We've been here before several times, and I think the last time we were here, there was many different council members. So part of this will be an educational piece. Given the time, I think I'm going to try and go through this quite quickly, but we'll see where it goes. So Railroad Quiet Zone is a set of rules that were promulgated in 2005 when the Federal Rail Administration required the sounding of horns at all crossings, stipulated the volume and the duration of those horns, and allowed communities a way out if the communities decided that they wanted to add some other safety measures in addition to the train horns. The train horns had a proven safety record. They were sort of the status quo and a very good history and could be used for a statistical baseline. We'll get into that a little bit later. The rules as they were being adopted clearly identified that creating a quiet zone would be a local livability issue and that the feds were not going to be providing the money to provide quiet zones. They needed to be at least a half a mile long, not isolated, and the engineer would still blow the horn if there were a dog, a person, some activity happening near the train. So it's not absolutely quiet, but the engineer would have the discretion when he would blow the horns. Depending on which particular flavor of quiet zone you got, they could be reviewed annually, every 2 or 3 years, or every 5 years, depending on a safety target that one would hit. In the previous council sessions, we've identified 10 crossings basically through downtown, starting on the east end with 8th and Hilliard, Pearl and High, then the 6 crossings from Lincoln to Monroe, and Van Buren on the west end. I don't think we've had any serious discussion about any of the other signals or crossings in town. These 10 crossings all have actuated gates. They have what the railroad would call real-time warning, so that the signal knows the maximum length of time ahead of time that a train is going to be there. They were, and still are, state-of-the-art for a standard crossing. which would be 2 arms. The supplemental safety measures, in large part, are designed to prevent I think the most spectacular type of crash, when you have the 2 gates down, and we even have some local instances of the gates are down, the lights are flashing, the bells are dinging, and the driver decides that he's going to weave through the gates and gets nailed by a train that no one would be expecting to have happen. They're frequently fatalities because they are quite spectacular crashes. So by use of median islands or a non-traversable curb that would extend at least 100 feet back from the crossing, we can furthermore encourage those drivers to not make very poor decisions. Quad gates is a more technical solution where we would have 2 gates that would come down and close on the entry, and then by use of vehicle detection, make sure that once the vehicles had left, we close the exit to that lane. Clearly, the safest crossing is one that is closed in its entirety, or say similar to the Chambers connection or the E-Web viaduct, grade separated, where vehicles, pedestrians, and the trains are not occupying the same space. And another option that's been mentioned was a wayside horn, basically moving from the horn from on top of the train, where it has to be very loud, very far away, to putting the horn right at the crossing. So the top picture is, I'm sorry, be a pointer here. These would be the normal gates that we would have closing the entrance. And in quad gates, there would be a second gate here that would close, but we would sequence closing those 2 gates, wait until cars had exited, and then close these gates to prevent that sort of crash. With the median barrier or the island, we would have to go back 100 feet. And sorry about the quality, but commercial driveways and streets in that 100 feet would need to be closed. So as you get into looking at what the actual options at an individual crossing are, there are varying impacts to businesses. Wayside horns, when we want the sound level to be 90 decibels at an intersection and the train is moving and is up to a quarter mile away, the train horn has to be significantly louder than that. We do have the technology to put the horn right at the intersection. The downside of that is that as soon as the horn comes on, it's at 90 decibels for the entire duration. It doesn't ramp up as the train gets closer. It also doesn't peak as loud, but there would still be horns sounding the same amount for every train. The federal risk analysis is a very interesting non-dimensional number that compares the risk at crossings. The risk is based on the amount of cars going through, the number of trains going through, the local history with, is this in a crossing that has had previous crashes. The Federal Rail Administration tracks a national number. We have, their database tracks our local intersections. And each of the different supplemental safety measures, median barriers or has a slightly different effect. Over time, the national threshold has varied in the 14 to 16,000 range. When we first started looking at this, the 8th and Hilliard crossing had very low car volume and no crash history. It was 11,000. Since then, we've had at least 2 crashes and included 1 fatality there. It's now at 50,000. Other intersections have either gone up or down over time, depending on the biggest factor being the crash history. In the past, we've looked at a number of different options. In the memo to council, mentioned that you can obtain a quiet zone by putting a supplemental safety device at every intersection, or by using a statistical average of the different types, you can obtain a quiet zone that's below the national index or below your local index with horns. When we first started looking at this, the national index was higher than our local index. Based on our crash history, our local index is now higher than the national index. And so these things would change over time and need some more detailed analysis. I think this is the most recent time I ran some of the options that you could get with the Federal Rail calculator. This is some of the work from 2007, looking at some of the different options. Businesses have changed. There's different accesses now. So we would need to do a lot more analysis to come up with an alternative to what the last council decision was, and that was reflected by, sorry, excuse me, I have big thumbs. All quad gates at each of the crossings. Part of the reason I believe this came back to council was rumor that Salem, Oregon had obtained a quiet zone, and it is true, they did. Most of it is downtown. It's very similar to ours. There were 10 crossings. They had estimated that it would cost $1.2 million, and in their pavement bond measure, very similar to ours, they had actually included a quiet zone as a line item, an identified piece they were going to do. Fascinatingly enough, it cost $2.6 million instead of the $1.2 that they budgeted. And I've had quite a few conversations with them. They used all the low-cost, the median barriers that Federal Rail Administration would estimate at $15,000 to $30,000 each. They did convert a two-way street to a one-way street. They closed some driveways to businesses that were located very close to the tracks. They actually did some tests with wayside horns. Wayside horns in 2005, 2006 were estimated to cost $70,000. Salem believes they would cost about $200,000 each, and we would still have the horns sounding, so they stopped considering that. They are working on extending their quiet zone. 2 crossings, one of them will require quad gates, and everything I hear from their staff is if we're going to consider quad gates, $1 million is a very good budget number to be considering. As I said earlier, we've been here several times trying to give the background on the Federal Rail rules, the options we could proceed with. We were made an offer with federal funds for closing crossings. The Secretary of Transportation had an initiative to close redundant and unnecessary crossings. ODOT Rail was very interested in closing some of our crossings. I think the 6 crossings in 6 blocks, I've been told that I will lose if I try to argue that none of those is completely redundant and every one of those is vital to the community. We did significant public outreach to look at things like, could Washington, Jefferson be one-way streets? Because a one-way street solves the going around the gates, because I just have entry-level gates. And in our outreach to the community seemed to not think that was a good idea. They did not like the idea of closing any of the streets. And I think the result was the 2008 council meeting where all quad gates and staff was to look for money. We've been unable to find money since 2008. I think the big lessons we learned is that the Federal Rail cost estimates are 50% or less of what they would actually be. There also is the ADA requirements for the sidewalks, and a lot more is going into the crossings than just the gates or just a median island, as we've done all the infrastructure around them. In Salem, low-cost improvements averaged $260,000 per crossing, and it was all locally funded. So I was going to talk about those technical aspects. I think there are other aspects, the community livability, that Robin Hostick was going to address.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I think I can do this in 3 minutes or less. Just a few brief remarks about why the quiet zone is important, and I think it's abundantly clear and obvious that it's a quality of life issue. That's acknowledged, I think, pretty clearly in the regulation itself. And I'm sure all of you have heard from many constituents about the details of how it affects people today. We have a remarkable vision, and we've worked hard to create that vision. It includes a strong set of ideas about how to project our values into the future, and an important part of that is remaking downtown and other core commercial areas. And the idea is obviously to create these thriving urban centers and to create real capacity to accommodate our growth in the future. And all along we've said this is not a plan that we want to stick on the shelf and forget about, and we need to be focused on implementation. So given that, we need to continually ask ourselves when opportunities arise, is this closer to the vision or is it not? We've also talked a lot about the challenges of redevelopment and creating opportunities in core areas like downtown. I say downtown because it's one of the few places that's even close, as we know, to being near that threshold for redevelopment. So even if it's close, it still takes a tremendous amount of investment, tremendous amount of attention to make the kinds of transformations that we want to see happen actually happen. So it's easy to imagine what it might be like if you're living or if you're working near one of the crossings right now where you are affected by the train horns. And by extension, it's pretty easy to imagine what an investor, what a lender, or what someone who wants to do a project might be thinking, whether it's bringing in housing or jobs or businesses, knowing that they have a choice. Am I going to do this project in Eugene, or am I going to do it in one of the 600 other communities that have a quiet zone? So it's a question worth asking. And when you start looking at it from this perspective, it's clear that it's not just a quality of life issue, but it's also a very meaningful investment and something just to keep in mind as we look forward. That concludes my comments. I think that was less than 3 minutes.
You're just about right on schedule. Mike, did you have one question you wanted to ask?
It was a comment. Actually, there is a question. Why not some of the other neighborhoods in West Eugene, the Train Song area and that particular area? I think they deserve a quiet zone every bit as much.
I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that. I think we've gotten the most complaints from the downtown and the businesses.
I think this is custom made for a bond campaign. I would support, absolutely.
So I just want to make a statement that I think you told me this, and is that we currently have 28 trains going through here daily.
I think it's actually 21 or 22 after I followed up with ODOT. Okay. So, I mean, it has varied over time, and I thought that it was 24 and going up, but the last count was
30 at one point.
Yeah.
So the point is there's a lot of traffic moving through our community and a lot of horns blowing, and I guess there's two things. One is that you have some economic opportunity coming where there might be an opportunity to find some dollars to support doing something some places, and the other is that we've had neighborhoods that forever have been begging for somebody to do something to make their quality of life better, and I consider that even beyond the point of livability. It's like everybody should live in a neighborhood that is livable, that everybody has the right to live somewhere where they don't have to close their windows in order to survive. So I think this is a really important issue for all of those reasons, economic and just because we all live here and deserve to have a certain quality of life. So I think it's a very important discussion, and I look forward to the next edition of this discussion. Thank you so much. Yes.
So, Tom, the cost matrix slide, can you get to a quiet zone with those other levels of lower cost?
All of these,
Well, not that one. That one's the old one.
all of these would
Million, 3.5.
get, all of these would get there at the lowest, among the lower levels.
So you could, in that 2.4 to 3.5 million dollar range, get a quiet zone? Is that what you're saying?
I believe that I could. Again, there's diagnostic, and it's a three-way sort of tug-of-war between the railroad, the ODOT rail, and the local road jurisdiction. But putting in median islands will have business impacts. Converting Jefferson and Washington to one-way does, again, work against some of the previous council goals. And the downtown plan to eliminate one-way streets. But with your guidance, I believe we could certainly enter into those negotiations with the other parties to get a quiet zone. And it works mathematically, although our current risk level being at, say, mid-1,400 levels, and that first option being at high 13,000 levels means that it's close. It's not a slam dunk, and we might have to go to something else. But this was just a first stab at saying this is certainly possible and close.
Yeah, but that's much more reasonable than $10 million. But it's still $3 million, which is where we were back in 2008 when we had this conversation, which we couldn't find. So
Yeah, we haven't found the 4 yet. So
there's two pools of money that look real promising for me for the lower cost ones. One is the urban renewal money in the Riverfront Research Park for these areas. I think they're within that district. Another one would be the road bonds that we would go out again for another 5 years, 4 years. I thought he was another 1 or 2 years.
It's definitely bondable. It's one time.
Well, I think
the 8th and Hilliard,
You wouldn't do a $3 million bond, but
8th and Hilliard signal is, I think, close to the urban renewal zone. I think the other signals are outside that district.
the ones on Pearl and High.
8th and Hilliard definitely is in. High Street is probably on the boundary, and the other 8 are outside.
we have to wrap it up,
right.
guys.
We're over time.
Yeah, we're over time. Thank you.
Doable.